everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. As Maíra mentioned, I've been having this lecture tour here in Brazil, 3 lectures over the last 3 days, and this is the last one of my tour. And obviously, I kept the best one for Rio, for the best part of Brazil, I must say. And what's there not to like about Rio? We spent the day on the beach, and so it was just so great. And Monica, I was thinking that we should do some sort of partnership, so I should come here more often.
That's a very good idea.
When I was lying on the beach, I was thinking, right, this is kind of a dream for a professor, right? Just like being able to sunbathe during the day and then lecture in the evening, right?
Why not?
That's perfect, right? So, I think the topic we've chosen is interesting on a number of ways. As Maíra mentioned, I've been working on DDR of ex-combatants for a while now. But with BRICS and the rising star of BRICS, especially in recent times, it's really interesting what's been happening in geopolitics, and the BRICS countries really kind of turning into a serious alternative to global governance by the West, or at least it seems to be, right? That's the kind of what we see in the media, so much reporting about it. Clearly, there is an interest about BRICS. And also BRICS expansion. So it may be BRICS plus, and that plus may include so many other countries. I don't know how BRICS countries will be happy about some additions, but that's kind of something to talk about. But the genesis of this talk really about the global governance of aid, and particularly response to conflict by the international community. And obviously, when I talk about the international community, I'm talking about the powerful Western countries. And then I think I'm looking for an answer, right, in terms of all the failures that we experience with the international community's engagement in different war-affected countries. Whether or not BRICS countries and other emerging donors could be an alternative in responding to conflict, and particularly with the challenges of DDR, Disarmament, Demobilization and Reintegration of ex-combatants. And from now on, I'm not going to say the full thing, it's DDR. It's really mouthful. So let's start really. And to do this, I think there are 3 parts that I have in this talk. First, I want to start with the liberal piece, the kind of the overall framework of where this is coming from. And then I'm going to contextualize DDR within SSR, another jargon, security sector reform. And then I want to move to kind of like some of the issues related to Turkey in Somalia. Maíra, absolutely right. I want to give that example in terms of, what an emerging actor and what possibly BRICS countries could do in conflict response. And at the end, I want to generate a discussion here. So around the role of BRICS, this is just really not even a field at the moment in terms of DDR and BRICS. This is a historical moment. We are really putting the foundation.
We're invented here and now.
Yeah, absolutely. Just now, you and I sitting here, 7 o'clock with kind of Thursday evening, we are inventing the research topic. But I think there is a kind of a really interesting stuff here for us to explore, because the world is changing so fast, and with the BRICS and with the geopolitics, I think we'll be asking some interesting questions, right? So I'm really looking forward to our conversation too. So let's start with the liberal piece. And so I'm sure most of you really are familiar with this, but I think it's really important to remind ourselves what we are talking about here. So since the end of the Cold War, nearly like 30 years now, the international community has been going around and implementing peace from a particular perspective, which we describe as liberal peace because of its nature of really, I think I often summarize this to my students is to create the mirror images of Western countries, Western governments, and Western economies in war-affected countries. And unfortunately, this whole response hasn't really considered the differences of the war-affected countries. Whether it's Afghanistan or Timor-Leste or Sierra Leone or Liberia or Kosovo or El Salvador, in all different parts of the world, the international community goes and prescribes the same medicine. So whether you have a headache or you have a cancer or you just had COVID-19, right? The international community says, well, this is what you need, right? So this is kind of like almost an ideology, right? To kind of like for building peace. And within that, the actors are so familiar. We are talking about Western countries and their international institutions, financial institutions like the World Bank, IMF, as the kind of main implementers of most programs. And there's a heavy securitization of the whole process. Although we talk about peace building, but in fact, what is done is state building. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit, the difference. I think it's really important. And I think for BRICS countries, it's going to be quite an important distinction to make. So kind of for them to understand what they are engaging. And typically, we are talking about democratization, privatization, the strengthening of civil society, security sector reform, right? These are typical kind of like menu items for the international community in implementing their conflict response in those countries. So let's move to the next slide. And there are really 6 pillars in this very securitized understanding of peace building. I will be looking at, obviously, some of them more closely, like SSR and DDR in a minute. But I think it's also important to remember that as part of that state building, for example, the reform of governance is one of the kind of the key aspects because the state building and so reforming the governance of Afghanistan, really kind of like perhaps you are establishing ministers, all sorts of directors, etc. And often from scratch, right? That kind of like work. Rule of law, it's about perhaps writing a new constitution and all sorts of laws, rules and regulations, and also respect to rule of law, right? Because you are really talking about countries affected by armed conflict by sometimes not only years, perhaps for decades. So lawlessness is probably the norm. So in a kind of that environment, that becomes one of the key challenges. How you are going to establish rule of law, how you are going to implement that, all the actors, training of all sorts of, like from judges to kind of like the people working in prison, right? So it's, again, really big expanded work. Human rights is a kind of an element, and in the liberal peace, the kind of this whole idea of unity of democracies, democratization, and human rights tends to be a really significant aspect of that. And also kind of like at individual level for different groups, women, children, and their specific rights. So human rights agenda tends to form at least as a lip service, as if, at least as kind of a menu item. You have that. So remaining 3 are really interesting. Security sector reform, I'll come to that. But now let's move to the other 2 that I have problem with. Next one, please. So typically, in a liberal peace building in those countries, one of the things that we sell to those war-affected countries is that the idea of democratization. So, as you know, liberal peace proposes that democratic countries are less likely to go against war with each other because they are democratic and people don't like wars. So this whole rationality of human beings that, that actually that's false. Human beings, I don't think rationals, but nevertheless, that's the kind of the starting point. And the market economy is that you need to have that in order to sustain democracies, right? That's kind of like the twin relationship there. But this is a very distorted way of implementation. So the word democratization is the most undemocratic way of thinking about democracy, right? Democratization is a type of power relationship. It's outsiders coming and democratizing you, right? Because somehow you are not democratic, but also perhaps you are not civilized enough, right? You haven't really enjoyed the Western democracy in your country, in your society. So us, the Westerners, will show you what to do. We will democratize you. So we need to be really careful with that word. I think it's a very loaded and it's a kind of one of the key ideology of the liberal peace building that I find very problematic. And so much so that, the organization of that first national elections is considered as democratization. And often we organize the first national elections in order to send that message back home to our constituencies to say, hold on a second, look, we organize the elections in Afghanistan, we sort them out, and now they are a democratic country. Wow, probably is the most simplest, understanding of democracy, but that's what we do, right? I think that's very problematic. And the second part of the market economy, this is just like a wholesale thing with liberal peace. We don't give any other options of, economic governance. So market economy, especially with the kind of like the small state, big private sector, no subsidies, privatization, and really kind of free hand with the exploitation of natural resources. That's very much what the international community tries to create in those countries. And especially if those countries have rich oil, gas, etc., this kind of energy resources, hell, this is all about marketization and privatization. And so much so that it's just so double standard in my eyes. Because, in those countries, we say, well, the subsidies are really bad. The market needs to be free, right? Everybody should be able to sell whatever they want. And especially kind of like the big companies from outside, multinationals, selling all products to you in war affected country. But in return, you are going to face so much economic kind of challenges. And at the same time, when you think about European Union as the toughest, the kind of protectionism for agriculture. And when it comes to war-affected countries, we don't allow those states to have any protectionism at all to protect their farmers, their small businesses, right? So do you see the kind of like the way we implement this, one thing for our countries in the West, but something else for war-affected countries? Total double standard. So I think there's two aspects of democratization and the market economy, and the way that these are implemented in those countries. For me, that is just outright attempt of creating dependency, so that those war-affected countries would depend on the West. We are not going to those countries to recover them, to make them peaceful. It is, I think, the agenda is much more cynical. I'm a cynical person, so perhaps it's not surprising, but I think that's how I read, in terms of what happens in those countries. So let's move to the next one. In the temple, Greek temple, you saw like 6 pillars. One was security sector reform. Now I'm moving to DDR. So by the way, how many of you studied DDR here? How many of you are familiar with DDR? Okay, perhaps I'm going to do some basics here. After all, it's a class, right? So, you might even write an essay on this. It's a really interesting subject, so much so that I've been, living with DDR over the last 20 years. That has been my research. I enjoy it, and I'm sure you enjoy it too, because it's a really kind of a central part of peace building. If you do DDR, you are related to all aspects of peace building, and it's a really, sort of social, economic, political security. You've got all these areas informing and also, affecting the other aspects. So security sector reform really started at the end of the Cold War for the West to do something with the former Soviet countries, kind of like the socialist countries in their transition. That was really kind of the first generation of SSR. But ultimately, it's kind of evolved and kind of came to the kind of what we understand as DDR in the second and third generation. And within that, there are some key aspects. The first one is that what are you going to do with armed groups that have been fighting in these conflicts? And in some cases, there may be like 10, 20, 30. I mean, for God's sake, in Syria, at some point, there were over 1,000 armed groups. So, you know, if there is some sort of like a peace agreement or something, you got to do something with these armed groups, right? So management of these groups, whether it's the political or socioeconomic reintegration of them in society. So that's number one. The second part is all about the security, the state, the kind of like the and its apparatus in terms of national army, the police force, and everything that you might need to restructure them. And often the peace agreement advocates that all this new national army and police force might be drawing certain number of case laws from different armed groups. That could be the main reason why those different parties agreed on that deal. The third part is more about like the landmines and small arms and the control, which is a really critical point. Because in some countries, like Afghanistan, for example, at one point there were over 5 million, landmines really polluting the fields, and which makes the whole life insecure, and also agriculture, really difficult to develop. And also the kind of your borders, like when you think about state, one thing about that is controlling of its borders, right? That's what the security sector reform is. Maíra, let's move to DDR. Definitions. So we know what we are talking about. Very simple, straightforward. Disarmament is being able to collect and manage and dispose all the arms that were available in that particular conflict, because if you want to kind of move from war to peace, that's going to be one of the most critical aspects. But later on, when I talk about DDR, we will realize that, collecting arms, and what percentage of that we manage, that's something else. But at least, rhetorically, that's what the disarmament aims to do. Demobilization is about all these members of different armed groups. For their return home, you've got to get them ready for that. And sometimes this may take only 4 days in terms of registration, some health checks, and sending them back home because they may have some home to go. But sometimes this may be up to 6 months a year, keeping them in camps, which is called cantonment, right? Which could be quite a complex and difficult process. But that's, like you collected the arm, you send them back home, and reintegration, the final phase, is about what to do with them for their reintegration. How you can help them in their social, economic, and in some cases, political reintegration into society. And the genesis of this whole thinking is that if you don't do this, those people who fought could be peace spoilers, right? So in order to sustain your peace, it's really important that you address their socioeconomic needs so that they don't see weapons and fighting and war or engaging in criminality, wouldn't be an option. Because we've seen this so many times, like in places like El Salvador, for example. So reintegration, when it's kind of like in the simplest term, is about like reintegrating in that civil life with some sort of livelihoods and some kind of social kind of context. All right, so enough of the definitions. Let's talk about people. I think for me, as a peace and conflict studies scholar, I always start from people, not states, not institutions, because that really kind of gives you different understanding of first the problem, and also what you're going to do about that. And unfortunately, liberal peace is so state-centric that it's all about institutions and governance and the kind of state, and they forget about people. And if you notice, I don't use the term soldier. I use the term combatant. And the reason for that, it is much wider, because we are talking about not only those who were in a regular security force, but we are talking about like the guerrillas, like the militants, we are talking about terrorists, depending on how you define them and describe them, right? And also, not everybody fight, being part of an armed group, fights on the front line. So what we see is that, for example, many women take roles in armed groups, but not as fighting. For example, in many African countries, their role may be like the wives of the combatants, and children. They take really kind of specific roles. Yes, there are child soldiers, right? But also there are lots of children doing other things, like working as messenger, or like the sort of upkeeping the camps, etc. Right? So combatant is much wider term that we use in order to encapsulate both this kind of wider selection of roles and also different types of people involved in this. Right? So I took this picture in Afghanistan. Right? Basically, what you see is that 5 young men, right? And they look like, farmers. And they are farmers. But they are farmers only like part-time basis. So in Afghanistan, after the 2002 international intervention, there was a period that, quietness, which the international community didn't really use for its purpose. They deployed their peacekeeping only in the capital, Kabul, and left the rest of the place to own its devices. And then, surprise, surprise, the Taliban got really strong and the fighting restarted. And so during that time, after 2002 Bonn Agreement, this young man, yes, they were farmers, but also seasonally they were fighting. So in Afghanistan at the time, if you pay $2 a day to US dollars, then you can actually form your own little army, right? So the point I'm making here is that the fluidity of the identity, even in post-conflict environment, the idea of combatant, ex-combatant, it's not that fixed. Really, it's just sort of like transitional in a way, depending on their socioeconomic realities, right? So you got to be really careful about, even our case load, what we are talking about. So that's number one. The next one, Maíra, is the kind of really gender element. And I think so significant it is. Because women and girls, female soldiers, they experience the war as a combatant differently than men. And yes, there is a kind of like the gender-based violence experienced by boys and men too, but predominantly it's really against women. So there is that gender-based violence as part of their fighting. So the type and level of trauma they experience tends to be different. But more importantly, with reintegration, their real challenge starts, because as a typically adult male, when you go back to your community, you tend to be welcomed as some sort of hero, right? So you are coming back from the front line, you protected your community, etc. But for women, there tends to be quite a significant stigma that they have to experience. Because in many societies, fighting for women is not considered as like, to do things because they're away from their families, etc. And also, some of these women need to go back home with some children with them, right? So the whole prospects of getting married would be really difficult, and in some traditional societies, they are kind of seen as not clean enough. I mean, all this terminology I'm using from the grant. So that stigma is really important, and also more importantly, they may be kind of like a really important commander during the war. Perhaps they were leading many men during the war. But when they go back home in the post-conflict environment, they are expected to go back to their more traditional roles. So they are expected to become a wife or mother, So that is also very challenging. So their access to their sort of post-conflict socioeconomic reality. So supporting female combatants becomes a very critical issue. So it's not only men, but also women. And you've got to address them through a specific way. Next one, please. Right. So this picture is from El Salvador. And as you know, El Salvador peace agreement and the way it was put together in relation to land reform for FMLN combatants, it was heralded as a success, a big, good example. right? But I went there 10 years later, just kind of see what happened to those ex-combatants benefited from that program. So those three gentlemen you see there were at different ranks during the conflict, right? I think they fought for nearly like 5-7 years, one of them over 10 years. And when I talked to them, their stories were just so different, their experiences of post-conflict rebuilding of their lives. So one of them was given a plot of land as part of DDR, right? That was the kind of part of the peace agreement. Only 2 years later, he had to sell that because it was really the worst type of soil and the type of land. So although the kind of El Salvador peace agreement was kind of considered a really good example, but the reality, yes, before the war, nearly 90% of land in El Salvador was controlled by 13 families. So the land reform was really important. But combatants, ex-combatants were given really bad land. So they couldn't really cultivate it. And more importantly, for agriculture, cultivation, you need other things like support with microcredit support, like buying fertilizers or tools, etc., right? They didn't have that. And more importantly, that's also really interesting. Most of those FMLN, former FMLN combatants given a land, piece of land, didn't even want to become a farmer. Right? It was an ideological thing, right? The FMLN leadership wanted that because it was part of their ideology and what they fought for. And then the DDR reintegration should have that sort of land aspect, right? So one of them, when I talked to him, was living in pretty much in poverty, right? The post-conflict environment didn't really make any difference for him at all. In fact, probably his life, this is an ironic thing to say, but his life was worse than what it was during the war. Because during the war, probably he had more respect, he had a little bit more kind of credibility, he had his comrades, etc. Perhaps his life was at risk. But when we think about combatants, we really look at them from our own perspectives. But being a combatant has other values I'll be talking about. The second one there is that he was sent to Oxford for to study, because he was one of the top leaders, right? So he had that scholarship. So we treat combatants, ex-combatants, differently. So if you're an ordinary file and rank kind of combatant, probably just a piece of land, that's what you'll end up with. But if you're higher up commander, you end up with something quite interesting. And for that person, after the scholarship, his life changed significantly. And the third one was an educated person before the war. And now, when I went to El Salvador, he was running one of the largest civil society organizations in the country. So the point here is they kind of like cutting a long story short. DDR itself doesn't make that much difference. But what makes the difference is that, one, who you are before the war, like in terms of your education, your gender, your age, and whether or not you had a vocation, job, etc. before the war. Then it's much easier for you to kind of reintegrate and rebuild your life. That's number one. And number two, the formal reintegration assistance, really, we shouldn't exaggerate its impact. Perhaps it gives a chance for some sort of reintegration, but in reality, what happens afterwards, once that formal process comes to an end, that's what matters, right? The overall conditions. And finally, the last person that I want to introduce you, a child. Right? So you hear about child soldiers, right? And that's a kind of a specific group, those who are under the age of 18 when they register themselves as a combatant. So I think the point that we need to remember here is that, often, they are either forced and sometimes volunteer in the fighting, but the key point is that their formative upbringing took place in that armed environment, right? The life they know is very much about fighting, right? And because of their sort of heightened level of loyalty to the commanders, they are preferred, and this is why they are recruited, right? Because they question less. So in many places, for example, if there's a dangerous area to kind of clear, armed groups send child soldiers first. And in order to get them sort of braver, they use drugs, they use all sorts of doctrination. So these children are really kind of like ruined in terms of their lives and experience huge level of trauma. And so when it comes to their reintegration, you know, from a very Western-centric point of view, we consider education will solve all the problem. So we give them education. But the reality is that if you are a 16, 17-year-old person in Afghanistan or Sierra Leone, you are a pretty much breadwinner. Probably you have your own kids. So, you know, this whole definition of, you know, child and adult also is kind of critical. But also, like, you know, the way we are responding. So basically, with these four, you know, groups, what I'm saying to you is that the complexity of reintegration and how we should address those different needs. So when it comes to DDR, we are really dealing with a wide spectrum of social, economic, political, and psychological kind of challenges in that process. Right. Quickly, I'll give you Afghanistan as an example, then I'm going to move to BRICS. Afghanistan is probably how not to do it kind of case. It's a bizarre case in many ways. And I'm not surprised that, you know, after the Bonn Agreement intervention of nearly 19 years, Taliban took over so easily. Because we really created a state that is not really able to function, so dependent on the West. But just please look at this state building strategy for Afghanistan and look at those countries, right? They are typical, aren't they? They are typical global North countries, right? They are the main funders. So in the model they use in Afghanistan, each country took one particular responsibility of state building. So United States, military reform, surprise, surprise, right? The US is always interested in the army, right? You're always the kind of like the security. So that's that. They said, we are going to deal with that. Germany said, well, you know, we have a past, we cannot be that militaristic, but, you know, we want to do something serious. We are going to do police reform, right? You know, that was their responsibility. Counter narcotics, United Kingdom. Because drugs are a big thing in the UK, and you know, they saw that they kind of like Afghanistan related their own security, so we should be really kind of playing an active role. But ironically, when the 2002 intervention took place, the whole kind of production of poppy seeds and the narcotics, if that was this level, by the time the international community left in 2021, it was that level. You know, it's just like the whole counter-narcotic strategy didn't produce any results, in fact, encouraging many ways. It's a long story, perhaps for another lecture. But there are two countries that I want to kind of point out. For DDR, it was Japan wanted to take lead country. And lead country means that pretty much you are picking up the bill, right? You are paying overall the cost of that. So Japan said, well, look, we might be a demilitarized country ourselves. So this is really ironic. Because of the Second World War, even in the Japanese constitution, it's written that Japan is not allowed to take any role in any armed group or anything like that internationally. They ignore that because Japan wants to change its own kind of position in global affairs. And they thought that this could be kind of quite a good testing ground. So they said, we are going to do DDR. Look, judicial reform. Oh my God. Italy led judicial reform. I mean, I don't know whether there's anybody here with the Italian background. I don't want to offend anybody. But, you know, Italy has its own issues with judicial system, right? So here in Afghanistan, they were leading the whole judicial reform, right? So the point, I mean, I don't want to kind of caricature the whole thing, but even a structure, you know, the way those kind of critical pillars were shared by the, you know, like the international community, kind of indicates something to you, right? Again, it just gives this kind of like the essence of this whole thing. The next one is for me just to sort of show you absurdity of this whole DDR spending, right? So Japan invested $167 million for the DDR in Afghanistan. That's fairly big budget, right? $167 million. With that money, they managed to collect 36,000 small arms and 12,000 heavy weaponry, and they consider that a big success. 36,000 small arms. I'm sorry, we are talking about Afghanistan. Afghanistan, a country that has been war since 1979. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, really. Because people are not stupid. These armed groups are not stupid. They are not going to give their weapons just because you ask for them, right? So having spent $167 million, that was how much they managed. And 55,000 former combatants, so-called reintegrated. You know, they were put into some sort of vocational program. You know, typically, you know, it was, you know, it may be carpentry, car mechanics, etc. You know, you put them in the classroom for 3 months, pay them stipend, and they learn something or not, that doesn't matter. At the end of 3 months, they sign the paper, and you say, okay, you are reintegrated, you can go back home now, right? But my story is something else here. Now, at each level, you have a different organization there. So it was led by UNDP's Afghanistan New Beginnings Program, AMBP. AMBP contracted different aspects of this to international organizations. International organizations, you know, commissioned the work to local organizations. So by the time, you know, what reached to those former combatants was just around $43 million. So that's roughly $700 per combatant, right? So this is one of the absurdity of the international peace that we build in different places. Our budgets are big, but the real money that kind of benefited from, benefited by war-affected people is, you know, proportionally so little, right? So, hence, really, you know, you saw 5 men, the first slide, from Afghanistan. This is why they were fighting, because, you know, this whole reintegration idea really didn't meet their needs at all. Okay, now, I'm now moved to BRICS area. Next one. But before that, really, I think we need to just wrap up, right? I can talk about DDR for days. Trust me, you know, there's so much to talk about, but you don't want to hear all that. So let me just sort of point out some of the critical assumptions made and the failures of DDR by the international community. So first of all, we make the assumption that, you know, by doing disarmament, we will somehow increase security. But we forget that, you know, those countries have porous borders and they never give up their weapons fully. So if they want to fight again, you know, finding a weapon is quite easy, right? So that kind of correlation is wrong, and liberal peace does that quite often. The second one is that we don't really appreciate what wars mean for these communities and combatants. Weapons have not only a security value, but also social and also economic. In many armed conflicts, combatants make a living out of their weapons through looting, pillaging, kind of, right? That's how they earn the money, and that's how they look after their families. The economic value is really important. And also social value, being part of an armed group, you know, comradeship, right? That's the only social structure you know. So those values are really important. Then if it comes to reintegration, once you take them from them, what's left there for them, right? So I think that that's something you need to bear in mind. I talk about the heterogeneity of combatants with my slides, right? They are not all male, they are not all adults, they are not all able-bodied, they are not all from the same ethnic group or the caste. So we really need to understand the kind of those differences and how those vulnerabilities kind of lead their chances in reintegration process. That's really critical. I think next one is that typically most DDR processes is like one man, one weapon approach, right? You register, you give up your weapon, whatever weapon you are giving up, right? and then you register yourself as a former combatant, and then you benefit from the reintegration assistance, right? But we forget about communities that receive those ex-combatants. And earlier on, what I said to you, right, the real reintegration starts once they are in their communities, right? So we don't really kind of do enough for receiving communities, and that's a really huge problem. And in some cases, these caseloads could be like 80,000 or 100,000 ex-combatants going back home. That's a big workload. I mean, like impact on the environment, on the, on availability of livelihoods, and even security, right? The whole perception of community is like all this, young men coming back from the front line and they know how to fight and everything. They feel quite insecure. So soul reintegration without communities could be so, difficult. Ex-combatants have a home to return. That is a really bad assumption, especially for child soldiers. Just one example, in Liberia, over 100,000 ex-combatants, nearly 20,000 of them were child soldiers. And for them to go home, the international community provided extra $150 so that they could take back to their families, so they would be accepted. Now, you can ask me, what's the problem here? Families obviously, want their children back home. Well, unfortunately, the way the war was waged in Liberia was such that, those children were forced to commit atrocities against their own families, against their own communities. So for families, even they accept, they wanted their children back, they had to think about, they kind of like their neighbors, their communities, what they would think about that, the whole stigma with that. And also in some cultures, fighting for children is considered as the kind of like the tainted soul. Their souls are so tainted, so badly damaged that no ritual can save them anymore. So they are risk for the community forever, right? So out of this 20,000 child soldiers went back home, the majority of them were rejected by their families and their communities. So you know what happened to them? They went back to Monrovia, the capital, and they found their former commanders. And their commanders were just like doing some illicit activity, and child soldiers were really easy recruit for them, right? So this is why violence has a kind of a transition from political violence to criminal violence. We've seen this in many places, right? So that's so typical. And finally, the point I'm making here is that jobs are important, but they are not the only thing needed by, by combatants, because the social environment, they kind of like their engagement with the normal life, there are other things, and sometimes really heavy psychosocial treatment because of the trauma they experience. Next one, Maíra. Okay, why is this happening, right? So this is me kind of unloading my kind of like the critique of the kind of like the global governance of interventionism, right? The first one, I think, is self-interested. The West intervenes in those countries, undertakes those projects and programs really because they have self-interest. This may be geopolitics, economic, energy, and whatever, right? The second one, it really creates a dependency culture, as I said earlier, right? The whole idea is really make those war-affected countries dependent on the West economically and also security-wise, etc. We tend to use civil society as intermediaries. You know what I mean with that? Intermediary as a kind of like, mechanisms, tools for us to implement our own programs. In many war-affected countries, the idea of civil society is no longer civil society. Civil society organizations, local organizations, NGOs in those countries are just firms. They implement projects for international community. They don't do advocacy, they don't do fundraising, they don't do checks and balances. All the critical aspects of civil society organizations. So we shouldn't kid ourselves that we are strengthening civil society in those countries. We just create our intermediaries to do the job for us, right? That's really important. the whole conditionality, that's a kind of a big thing about the global North interventionism, and using conditionality, especially against the state, right? And the argument often is that, those states are corrupt, so we need to avoid them, right? The whole idea of the corruption kind of scares the West so much, as if that the West is just so clean about corruption. Come to the United States and you will see the kind of the level of corruption. Probably in those countries you are talking about on a few $1 million. In Western countries, when there's a corruption, it's billions of dollars. But we label them as corrupt states and we want to avoid them. And there we use this conditionality. And that creates really tough relations with state actors, right? So, don't take me wrong, I see the point here, but it's the kind of the approach, like the state is bad, civil society is good, it's just really too simple as a binary to deal with a very complex environment, right? Securitization, this whole idea that, we need to improve security in those countries. It informs everything we do, the way we build peace, or the kind of recovery of agriculture, everything. And finally, bunkerization. Have you come across this term? The international community really keep itself in a bunker, like in Baghdad after the Iraq intervention. It was the green zone, right? All kind of military and the international NGOs living in one place. In Somalia, there's a peace camp. It's a kind of another place, bunkerization, right? All the kind of international actors in one place. And for local actors or local communities to get any access to these places are just almost impossible. So this is the kind of like the absurdity. We go to these countries to build peace for these people, but we don't engage with them directly. We don't even know. Come to Somalia example in a minute, you will be laughing. I mean, probably that's the worst case scenario ever. But that bunkerization really creates different type of relationship between international actors and local actors. So next one. What is there? Probably you were waiting for this question for a while now, but I came to this. So for BRICS countries and emerging actors, right? What is there, in terms of like an alternative? What could they do, right? Is there kind of like a real possibility for them to deal with all these challenges I was talking about? And, could we say that actually BRICS countries and emerging actors have a different story? They have different type of engagement, right? Let me give you the Turkey example in Somalia, and it's going to be only 3 minutes, I'm afraid. I have papers on it, you can read them. But the reason I'm giving is Turkey as an emerging donor, aid donor, I think it's a kind of a good example for what we can expect from BRICS, right? Typically, it started in 2011. The then Prime Minister Erdogan went to Somalia with a big entourage, 3 planes of people. He took his family, he took his pop stars, he took his film stars and business people, right? So the idea was that at the time, Somalia was facing a famine. That was a drought, and that was a real humanitarian crisis and internal displacement. But Somalia was a forgotten place in the map of international humanitarian crisis, like we have so many places today. We talk about Ukraine, but we don't talk about Yemen. We don't talk about DRC. These are forgotten places. In Yemen, do you know that 3 million people have been killed over the last 5 years? 3 million people. How many people know about that in the world? Nobody. But day and night, we talk about Ukraine. I mean, I put my hand on my heart. Yes, let's talk about Ukraine. But are their lives more valuable than those lives in Yemen? Well, the sad answer is yes, apparently, right? So this coming back to Somalia now, right? So this whole thing, 2011, Erdogan, kind of arrived, and from the plane landed, he started to send a different message. He said, I don't want the peacekeeping forces, Amazon, to protect us. Because Amazon is a regional peacekeeping force, mainly Kenyan and Ethiopian forces under the international commandership. has a very bad reputation in Somalia. It is seen as part of the conflict. And the international community, because of its long engagement in Somalia, had a very bad reputation at the time. So Erdogan was playing the card really carefully and cleverly. Saying that, look, we are different. We are going to bring something, a critical alternative here, right? And what was that? To start with, the international community was running its aid programs in Somalia remotely, like a remote controller. They were all based in Nairobi, all these organizations. All their representatives would fly to peace camp that I mentioned, bunkerization, next to the Mogadishu airport. They would meet their local NGO representatives there, right? And then they will take another plane, go back to Nairobi. Remote management of aid. Can you imagine that billions of dollars of the international community's money has been spent through remote management? And the reason for that is that, those international actors didn't feel secure in Somalia because in the eyes of local people, they were not there for them. They didn't have the legitimacy. They didn't have the trust. They didn't really see them as the kind of good partners to be, right? So Turkey has implemented a number of things differently in Somalia. I think could be really interesting for our discussion. So it wasn't only humanitarian aid, but they coupled that with trade. They coupled with scholarships for students. They opened their embassy in Mogadishu because there was no other embassy at the time, right? And also, Turkish Airlines started a connection between Istanbul and Mogadishu. That meant that after so many years, the people of Somalia finally could fly out of Africa without needing to go to another African country. In the eyes of Somalis, this was just like big change, right? They said, look, all these other international, countries, they've been kind of like spending the money allocated for us for their needs, but here we are. The Turks came here and they do something different, right? It sends quite a different message. And even the message itself, Turkey always talks about partnership because other countries have a colonial past in Africa. It's a big baggage. And really, many people in Somalia sees that, the international community as a neo-colonial power. They are here to colonize us again, right? That kind of colonization is really important. And the direct presence of Turkish aid. Now, Turkey spent $350 million in Somalia, both money from the state and private charities, fairly large money. And when we come to BRICS, I think we need to ask this question. Is there that kind of money in BRICS countries, to spend? Because these programs are really expensive. But, they spend that money through direct presence. What that meant, all the aid workers lived in Mogadishu. And in some cases, they live with their families, right? So the argument of the international community, Mogadishu not being secure so that they needed to live in Nairobi, was badly exposed. So clearly, you could live in Mogadishu, even you can bring your family from Turkey to live, your kids, So that created quite a different trust relationship, right? So probably, again, for BRICS countries, this could be an opportunity because the conventional actors from US, EU, and others, they have a particular reputation in those countries. So BRICS countries have an opportunity because as a new actor, perhaps, without really being affected by that kind of reputation, they can build different types of trust frames, trust structures, right? So the last slide then really point of conversation for us. Okay, so I'm thinking about BRICS. So just help me, obviously Brazil, well then you have Russia, right? And you have India, you have China, and you have South Africa and others to come, right? So let's think about those countries, right? So there are some critical questions, hard questions we need to ask, right? I mean, let's face it. Because when we give the critique of the international community, you know, we cannot let this new boy on the block without critique, right? So we need to give some critique of that, right? So it's not all very nice about BRICS, I assume, right? But please feel free to reflect on that. First one, do you think BRICS countries are more neutral, less self-interested in peace and conflict than conventional actors? I think it's a question to ask, right? Number two, are they really better resourced to fund such programs? Because, I mean, you know, the global aid governance is led by these Western countries because they pick up the bill, right? They spend their, taxpayers' money for such purposes. So would Brazil or Russia, China will be able to do the same thing? Because if you don't have money, I'm afraid you are not going to be able to do much, right? So that's, I think, really important. You know, as an idea, it sounds interesting, but would, for example, Russia have $350 million to spend in Somalia, or like 267 million in Afghanistan for DDR, right? That kind of cash, I think it's really important. And are they really better prepared or similarly prepared to run such complex, programs? Because the kind of conventional actors really build everything around their sort of Western-centric donorship, right? There is a very complex structure of giving and spending and all these organizations, etc. So seriously, if you want to talk about BRICS countries taking active role in this, you need trained people from these countries. You need to have bilateral agencies in these countries. So in Turkey, you have the Turkish Development Agency, and I think Brazil has a similar one. But how well resourced they are, whether or not they can take, operations in those countries. I mean, those operations are very costly. So these are like three immediate questions come to my mind. I'm sure that you have other questions come to your mind, when we think about BRICS in DDR, or let's talk about really kind of like, conflict response, peace building in general, but DDR particularly, because the way I presented, I think I'm hoping that it gave you the kind of the idea that it's a kind of a place. In fact, some BRICS countries could have a good kind of opportunity to do something different, right? Because of the past, etc. So that was my question. Why should we expect that BRICS countries and other emerging donors can do a better job with DDR challenges, right? So I'm going to stop there. And I don't know how much time we have. Monica, I think you will reflect, but one of the things that I really want to do, I want to hear from these people too, right? Because I've been kind of, bombarding you with lots of information, but I really want to kind of learn from you because you are citizen of a BRIC country. So I want to go home with kind of like Brazilian perspective on BRICS and what BRICS countries could do for conflict response, right? So, thank you.
Okay, I'll raise just a few questions. First, I don't think there's a BRICS perspective on peace processes, and certainly not on DDR. So there may be at some point, though I'm very skeptical. I do think that there is an interesting discussion here that, from my point of view, does not pertain to BRICS. It pertains to how countries in the global south can have a different perspective on peace building, on DDR, and this different forms of intervention in the context of conflict. I think that you talked about trust, but you were also talking about mutual respect. And I do think that the countries in, Europe and mostly Europe and North America tend to be disrespectful of the capacity of societies in other parts of the world of rebuilding their own countries. But I do think that in situations of conflict, of war, international actors, and I hate the term international community, but international actors can have a very, very productive role in mediating, in helping negotiate, because we're talking about what here? We're talking about, and you talked about the limits of a limited view of DDR. We're talking about rebuilding national communities, right? Political communities. What kind of political community are we building? And what is the role of violence within this new, different political community? Is the monopoly of violence by the state the solution? Or do we need other forms of thinking about redeploying violence, rethinking, reconceptualizing the role of violence in the context of rebuilding political communities? I think in this very, very, very complex and difficult process, international actors, actors from the outside, can have a very productive role. I do think that with all the problems that you mentioned, with which I obviously agree, there is a lot has been learned with our mistakes. And I don't think we should throw out all of this learning process, the baby with the water. Yeah. So I think we should depart from the idea that there is a role for international actors, and that international actors from the global south can have a different perspective. Not will necessarily, for sure, but can have a different perspective. Perhaps because there is more plurality, perhaps because there is less certainty about this perfect society, capitalism, the market, liberal democracy, than in the US and Europe. So perhaps more humble. I do think that there's a practical question that you did not touch upon, and I would really very much like to hear you about it, which is how the UN system stands in this discussion. Because we have these institutions and these practices were developed very much within the context of the UN system and of the very special relationship built between the UN system and these NGOs. And I think actually the political economy of this relationship, which you tackled, I think it is a very interesting and difficult theme. I think Tom wrote a book many years ago about the humanitarian business, Tom Wies, that was already concerned with this political economy. But how will these other countries from the global south, part of BRICS or not part of BRICS, how will they re-establish a relationship with the UN system? Will the UN system have a role in this new participation or different kind of participation in intervening and aiding in this process of rebuilding political communities? And we can, of course, look at examples. How the Turks have established a relationship with the UN system. How Brazil has established a relationship with the UN system. The case that is most interesting to understand the Brazilian possibilities and problems is Haiti, right? Where we have, and Maíra wrote a thesis about this. Where the Brazilian military, the Brazilian elite, the Brazilian NGOs had the possibility of experiencing something different. We all know where we are in Haiti, right? It's not a pretty picture, right? So very, very, very difficult But I think one question that needs to be asked is, does the UN system, or even regional organizations, and regional organizations with the UN system, still have a role to play? Or is this system reformable? And can these countries play a role? And finally, I have hundreds of questions that I would raise because it was so interesting to hear you, and I identified with so many of the things you said. But just one point that is perhaps a bit more philosophical, more sociological, that you did mention, but perhaps we could go back to it in the context of this question: can the global South play a different kind of role, which is the relationship between the individual and the collectivity, the individual and the community, the role of the community, which community, in the process of rebuilding this so-called national community. And in this sense, I think that there are some very interesting things happening today in Colombia, where in many cases, the people did not go back to their original communities. They rebuilt a new community from that. Of course, this is a very long war, but many of these new communities are being rebuilt in the context of the warring groups. And the peace process in Colombia allows for this. So perhaps there isn't one community. There are many different kinds of communities that we must consider: rural, urban, and perhaps the idea that you decommission, that you demobilize an individual is in itself flawed, because obviously there is no individual combatant. So I think this issue of what is collective, I'm not saying that you can't provide individuals with support, with psychological support, with financial support, so on and so forth. But if we don't give the idea of community, and again, not one kind of community, but many different kinds of communities, more of a role in this process, I think we will fail again and again. Perhaps countries in the global South will have more sensitivity to how these societies are organized, the history, the specificity, more listening about, listen, this is the kind of community we want now. So maybe doesn't fit very well with your liberal democracy and capitalism, but this is something that works for us.
Thank you, Monica. You didn't ask hundreds of questions, but you asked really 3 wonderful questions. Thank you. I'm going to be brief, so there will be time for the discussions. But all those issues are so fundamental in our thinking around like the possible role for BRICS countries in the global aid governance. That to start with, I think whether it's the United Nations, through the United Nations, or through regional organizations, but particularly the United Nations, the problem is this particular governance that has been established over the last 30, 40 years really monitors who is in and who is out in this particular system. So OECD-DAC countries, these are the main donor countries in these programs. They consider what they do as good donorship, right? So every other country, if you want to be part of that club, you need to assign to their principles, right? So this is not really, you can have different perspectives, you can have different ideas, but the system is much more rigidly drawn out. So they use some mechanisms which sound like wonderful when you first hear, but actually there's a dark side with them. Coordination and cooperation, right? So in Somalia, for example, all non-Western actors, Turkey and others, they are expected to cooperate with Western actors. that means that you need to do things in the same way, like all these traditional actors. And coordination mechanisms, which are often led by UN agencies, so whether it's the water and sanitation, this may be UNDP. If it's the refugees and IDPs, it may be UNHCR.
National coordination.
Yes. So these coordination structures, I'm afraid, although they sound like, we are going to have more effective assistance, but it controls like which NGOs will be part of them, which NGOs can be part of those coordination structures. And this is about co-optation. You either co-opt, and be part of it, or you are out of it. You are either with us or against us.
Sounds familiar.
Exactly. So I think the whole aid governance is not as innocent as it looks. Really, it's not that charitable. It's not that humanitarian, really. So this is my puzzle, right? So I do agree that, emerging donors can really have different voice, different ways of doing things, different perspectives. And especially with the kind of like the South-to-South partnership, like the way those countries could see each other, right? And but they are not really allowed to be sitting at the table, right? So they can only be there by being the other. So in the paper we wrote about Somalia case and the experience of Turkey, we call that the resistance power. Whether or not, as an emerging donor, you have that resistance power, because in all other places, the global aid governance does everything to kill you, to really, to take you out of that map, right? But in the case of Somalia with Turkey, it somehow worked, because when you have $350 million to spend, you have a voice, right? Then you have a chance to do things differently. You can actually be, present in the community, etc., right? And when it comes to mediation and negotiation, all tools of conflict resolution, you could say, well, I'm going to talk to the state as well as civil society, right? You may think that the state here is corrupt and you are just ignoring them, but with them, I'm going to work on the retraining of officers. I'm going to take them to Turkey. I will train them and send back here, right? Because you have the capacity. This is why the question I ask, I'm afraid having, the intentions and the possibilities of best interest or the possibilities of doing things differently won't be enough for BRICS countries. They really need to be, be able to put a fund together, some sort of budget together, or they need to be prepared to spend their money. If they don't, they are not going to have that resistance against the global aid governance in such places, right? Because often they are not going to be sitting at that coordination table. If you sit at that coordination table, you need to assign to liberal peace principles, right? You need to say that, yes, we need to democratize Somalia, democratize Afghanistan. Yes, market economy is the best thing, because our research in Somalia was about perceptions of Turkish perception of the international community and international community's perception of Turkish side. And we used the analytical framework of trustworthiness. And within that, we were looking at the ability and integrity. So how both parties saw each other's ability and integrity, right? The discussion, the interviews, we had like over 20 of them with those actors. That was just so revealing. With the international actors particularly, it all started, and it's almost like this professionalism of a international NGO UN official. Oh, we recognize that Turkey has been robust and timely action, and they brought significant assistance here, and then but starts, and then the things that they were pointing out, not that like the tangible things, but really abstract things like, oh, Turkey is not really part of good donorship values that we adhere to. What are these good donor values, right? this is almost like the secret agenda. I mean, this is really kind of like they draw up, the boundaries of this game is drawn up and the rules established by the West. So if you want to play the soccer with them, you need to play with their rules and in their pitch, right? You cannot have really alternative in the sense that it's so difficult. So Brazilian civil society organizations or Brazilian development agency going to place like, Africa, other places, it will be almost impossible to do your thing in the way you want, even if you kind of argue that South-to-South cooperation. Well, your chance there with regional organization, African Union, might have a different view because they're also fed up with the West. But the whole aid dependency is so important for even regional organizations, where their funding comes from. We really have to change this global order because they have the money and they dictate the rules of the game. So with all respect, you could have the best intentions and possibilities of doing something, as an alternative better. But implementing it will be very difficult with the coordination and cooperation frameworks they have and the governance structures and the whole kind of the stigmatization really being the other is just so critical. So I totally agree. Let's do that. But I think what excites me about BRICS is that I don't know whether they are going to ever come to this, but like the European Development Fund, like the big funds that put together, right, by the West, right? They invest for the reconstruction and peace building, right? Will the BRICS countries have their own fund to spend for humanitarian crisis, for peace building, right? If you don't have that kind of fund, if this is going to be like just a free old game and Brazil and Russia and China will do their own things, etc., I don't think that kind of unity, as you mentioned, won't be happening, right? So I think that is the main obstacle we are facing. At least, Somalia was a very revealing case. They saw that the Turkish assistance really exposed their inadequacies, their ineffectiveness, and their disintegration. They were not, their integrity was flawed. And Turkish presence showed that so clearly in the eyes of Somalis, it was an embarrassment, right? So if this is going to ever happen, trust me, this is going to be a very interesting fight. All these new actors arriving in the scene, starting to do really exciting, interesting things, won't be welcomed by conventional Western actors because they have their own global aid governance. And I believe that global aid governance is there for a purpose. We want to create dependable, war-affected countries, both security and socioeconomically. So that is a purpose. I don't know, have you ever seen any proper economic revitalization of any war-affected country? Ever.
Yeah, Germany after the Second World
Yes,
War.
Germany, right? Germany, right? Another European country. Have you ever seen any global South country that really received proper investment for economic revitalization? And that's the question, why? Because they don't want those countries to recover fully. Otherwise, how would you be able to exploit their mines and their oil, their natural resources? You got to keep them weak, right? That's what the liberal peace agenda is about. It is there for a purpose. So really, when we think about how to do something about this, how to address this, we need to be very prepared for resistance, and this is not going to be just like based on good ideas. It has to be more than that. Yes.